Chapter 1. The First Whispers. The heat of Port Harcourt pressed down like a heavy hand, sticky and relentless. Even after the rains earlier that morning, the air was still thick with humidity. Puddles clung stubbornly to the cracked asphalt, mixing with the oily sheen of discarded plastic sachets of water and diesel spills from rumbling yellow buses. By late afternoon, the bustle of Oil Mill Market had already begun to swell. Traders shouting, customers bargaining, hawkers weaving through the crowd with trays balanced on their heads. Chris wiped sweat from his brow as he maneuvered through the chaos. The sound of clattering pots and the smoky scent of roasted bowl and fish hitting him from every corner. He was used to the noise, the dense press of bodies, the calls of, "Come by," "fresh tomato," "fresh pepper." But that day, something gnawed at the edges of normality. Something was off. Near the goat meat sellers, a young woman sat slumped against a wooden stall, her eyes glassy. People gave her a wide berth, muttering to themselves. The market was no stranger to exhaustion, fainting spells, or sudden sickness. It was part of life in the city. But this was different. Her skin had gone grayish, her lips cracked as though she had been drained of moisture. Chris slowed, watching as two traders tried to rouse her. She didn't respond. "Carry him go hospital a beg," one man said, shaking his head. "Na so dem dey collapse these days. Strange sickness they move around. Nobody moved to help." People glanced uneasily at one another, then turned back to their buying and selling, choosing not to get involved. Chris walked on, his stomach unsettled. At Mile 3 Motor Park, the chaos was even worse. Conductors screamed out destinations. "Choba! Uniport! Rumacoro!" While engines revved and honked in deafening bursts. A driver cursed loudly at a Kekinapep that had cut him off. The smell of petrol hung thick in the air. But even here, whispers of sickness had begun to snake through the crowd. At the edge of the park, a group of men argued over a body stretched out near the gutter. The man's head lolled unnaturally to the side, blood dried around his mouth. Some swore he had been hit by a vehicle. Others muttered about a strange fever spreading through town. "Nobody dey talk him for radio?" a woman asked angrily. "Na every day I dey hear light go soon come, but nothing about this sickness way they kill people." "Government no go talk," another spat. "Dim go just cover him like Ebola that year." Chris didn't linger. He boarded a bus heading toward Transamati, the industrial district where he worked at a machine parts shop. The bus was packed, knees pressing against knees, sweat-soaked shirts brushing against strangers. Inside, the chatter was louder than the crackling radio playing high-life music. People spoke about a man who bit a nurse at University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital the night before. The nurse, they said, had collapsed and died within hours. Someone swore on his mother's grave that corpses at the mortuary had begun moving again. Everyone laughed nervously, dismissing it as drunken exaggeration. But the unease lingered. That night, back in his one-room apartment in Diobu, Chris listened to the buzzing of his rechargeable fan. NNEPA had cut power again, and the streets outside were cloaked in patchy darkness, broken only by generator hums and the glow of kerosene lanterns. He sat with his neighbor, a wiry man named Jonah who worked as a security guard. "You hear wettin' happened for oil mill today?" Chris asked. Jonah scoffed. "Na rumor. People too, they talk nonsense. Person die, dem go say na witch. Somebody sick, dem go say na new disease. Me, I know they believe until I see." As if on cue, the distant sound of shouting erupted down the street. The two men froze, straining their ears. "Thief! Thief!" voices yelled. Then screams followed, ragged and piercing. Chris and Jonah rushed to the balcony, peering into the shadows. A crowd had gathered near the corner, torches flickering. Someone lay on the ground, thrashing violently. Three men held him down, blood pouring from a wound on his arm. His teeth snapped wildly at anyone who came near. "He dey mad," a woman screamed. But Chris's blood ran cold. It wasn't madness. It was hunger. The next morning, Port Harcourt woke restless. Rumors ran wild. People biting each other in Burokiri. Strange deaths in Rumokoro. A preacher at Isaac Borough Park collapsing mid-sermon before rising again with blood in his mouth. On Radio River's 99.1 FM, the newscaster's voice cracked with tension as she insisted there was no cause for alarm. By midday, Chris returned to Oil Mill Market for supplies. The place was a hive of nervous energy. Traders packed up early, muttering about curses and strange fevers. Soldiers in green fatigues had begun patrolling the streets, rifles slung casually but their eyes sharp. Near a pepper stall, Chris froze. The same young woman he'd seen slumped the day before now staggered through the crowd. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, her mouth hanging open in a silent groan. When a man approached her, asking if she needed help, she lunged forward and sank her teeth into his cheek. The market exploded into chaos. Crates overturned, tomatoes spilled across the ground. People trampled each other in a desperate rush for the exits. Chris ran, heart hammering, the sound of screams chasing him through the narrow streets of Port Harcourt. The first whispers had turned into something real, something alive, something hungry, and the city had no idea what was about to consume it. Chapter 2. When the City Burns. The morning sun rose heavy and red over Port Harcourt, its light smeared across a haze of diesel exhaust and charcoal smoke drifting from roadside braziers. In the puddles left by the night's rain, the city was doubled. Yellow buses rippled, tin roofs wavered, faces blurred as people stepped around water and into another day. Hawkers tossed greetings across the road and ducked between Kekinapep tricycles that buzzed like hornets. Drivers leaned on their horns until sound itself became part of the heat. Chris stood in the doorway of the machine parts shop in Transamati with a rag in his hand and grease in the lines of his palms. He had come in early, the habit of years, but his body felt hollow, sleep stolen by the memory of a man thrashing in the gutter and the snap of teeth against night air. He told himself it had been a thief caught by angry neighbors. He told himself all cities scream sometimes. He told himself not to think about the young woman he'd seen slumped at Oil Mill Market the day before. Then a noise outside bent the morning in a new direction. "Chris!" his boss shouted from the back room. "You don't hear from the supplier?" "Where the bolts we order?" The radio on a shelf crackled with high life, then spat a crooked bulletin. Disruption at mile 1. Conflicting reports, callers insisting the government speak plainly. The announcer's voice carried too much cheer for the words. Chris wiped the counter and tried to breathe normally. In the far bay, a crooked fan turned the hot air without cooling it. The wrong shape of noise rolled up the road. Too sharp, too sudden. People were shouting names instead of prices. Someone was yelling, "Blood! Blood!" A bike swerved and clipped a vendor's table. Oranges burst and rolled, and a boy laughed too loudly, the way people laugh when they're afraid. Chris stepped outside. Down the block, a crowd had gathered around a bus listing against the curb. The driver leaned forward on the wheel, his forehead pressed to the horn, a thin, unbroken cry until a man reached in and turned the key. For a beat, everything paused. Then passengers began to climb out, shaky and pale. A woman stumbled, clutching her shoulder. A man tried to help her, and she jerked away like a startled animal. Her face turned too slowly. Even from a distance, Chris felt, in his bones, that her eyes were wrong. A second scream came from the junction where Transamati met Abba Road. Someone called for soldiers. Someone called for a pastor. The city was a map of sound, and new pins were being driven into it every minute. He went back inside because work was something he understood. He laid the rag on the bench and reached for a carburetor. He told himself to count bolts. He told himself he had errands after work, that he would pass by Diobu to check on Jonah, that he would buy bowl and fish on the way. He told himself a river kept moving as long as you didn't look too closely at the faces on its banks. His phone buzzed. A friend from mile 3. "Bodies they stand up again." An auntie near Rumokoro. "Don't go outside." Lock door. Someone dropped a video into a group chat, shaky and vertical, a man on the ground with 2 people kneeling over him, pleading. The man's chest was still, then not. He sat up in one unnatural pull, like a string had yanked him from above. The phone's microphone caught someone praying and someone cursing at the same time. "A beg off that thing," his boss muttered, though he didn't look away either. Outside, the street tilted further. A kiki hopped the curb. Men ran without glancing back. The first gunshot sounded like length of pipe striking concrete, too far to be sure. Chris gathered his tools. habit more than plan, and slid them into his backpack. He didn't ask permission to leave. He didn't say goodbye. When he stepped from the shop, the air felt heavier, as if the city had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go. At University of Port Harcourt teaching hospital doctor, Amaka Obi carried the smell of antiseptic and copper into the corridor. The night had not ended for her. It had only changed color. Fluorescence hummed alive, then died with the power, then returned on the generator's cough. The world blinked like a faulty eye. They wheeled in a man at dawn, his clothes shredded, his skin the color of wet paper. They lost him on the table in a rush of blood. Amaka had stepped aside to let the mortuary attendants do their quiet work when the man's hand twitched. It was the smallest wrong thing she had ever seen. She might have told herself she imagined it. Then his fingers spread and scraped for purchase, and his eyes opened, milked over like river glass. The intern beside her screamed. Amaka didn't. She jammed her fear into muscle memory. "Restraints," she snapped. No one moved. The man's mouth opened. No breath came, only a hungry scrape. He sat up with the insect jerk she was beginning to recognize and turned toward the heat of the intern's body. Teeth clicked together in a mechanical test. Later, she would not remember the words she used. Orders, a prayer, both. Security arrived too slowly and in the wrong order of readiness. One swung a baton into the patient's chest and it bounced, useless, off meat that no longer belonged to a person. The man fixed on the nearest shape of life. When his teeth sank into the guard's forearm, the room split open. The guard howled and shoved him down while a nurse sobbed and ran for help that was not coming. They tied him. They bled with him. He struggled with a patience that belonged to a job, not a fever. Amaka washed her hands and watched the water ring red around the drain. She considered the border between body and person and found it had shifted in the night. On the breezeway, she searched the sky for a steadiness she could borrow. The clouds hung low and full. A radio somewhere chirped rumors. Incidents at Braithwaite. Armed men on the roads. A preacher collapsing in Isaacboro Park and rising with his mouth at a congregant's waist. Someone said it was a hoax. Someone cried and said she could still hear the guard screaming. When the power failed again, the generator didn't catch. The corridor fell to a sluggish dark that widened and deepened. An elevator chimed and opened on a black box. From below rose a crowd sound, then a crash of metal, then a series of dull doors slamming as hands that should have been still found things to beat. Amaka gathered what she could carry, bandages, gloves, useless medicines that would still comfort hands. She told a nurse to keep people away from the mortuary. She did not say the word basement like it was a grave. She did not say the word morgue like it was a verb. In Diobu, Jonah Bassi drew a whetstone along the length of a rusted cutlass and watched the edge appear. The blade was older than his youngest child and had stopped 2 thieves in its life. He tested the balance, then leaned it against the wall beside the compound gate. Upstairs, Nkechi called his name with a tightness that meant she had been dialing and getting nothing. Her sister sold vegetables at mile 3. Her phone had rung and rung, then cut, then stayed dark. "Network go come back," Jonah said. "Lying because comfort is a duty, and some duties are heavier than truth." In the lane, boys moved quickly and pretended not to. A woman passed with a pan of sachet water on her head and didn't call out for buyers. A siren wailed and faded. Somewhere a generator coughed to death. A man from the next compound came to the gate and said he'd heard shooting near Garrison. He said soldiers were turning cars back on Abba Road. He said he'd seen people push a body into the gutter because no one wanted to be near it. He said all of this as if it might be several different cities until Jonah handed him a nail and told him to hold the board straight. They braced the gate with anything that could be lifted: bed frames, a broken refrigerator door, a wardrobe with one good hinge. Jonah had done this before. Smaller storms for different reasons. He checked the angles and listened for the sound of voices over panic. The sound that meant people were still choosing to work together. A baby cried upstairs. The sound cut into him like hunger. "Papa," Nkechi said when he came inside. "Rice fit reached 2 days. Kerosene small. Water no plenty." "Neighbor go share," he said automatically, already measuring everything by capfuls if the taps went dry. "What happened?" she asked low. "Tell me true." Jonah looked at his children on the sofa, wide-eyed, their feet not touching the floor. He thought about lies and about the shape of a father in a world that no longer respected walls. People dey sick, he said. People dey fear. We go close gate. We go hold. If anything come, we go meet him for outside before he reach children. He did not say he had seen a man's eyes that looked like wet chalk. He did not say he had heard the eating sound in a voice note from a cousin who hadn't sent another. In Waterlines Junction, Ifeanyi Fifi Okoro tilted his cracked phone so the camera could catch the street 3 floors below. He whispered because the building felt like a church in the wrong way. Hollow and stretched with listening, his live chat bubbled with, "Is it true and fake? And I'm watching from Abuja, and bro stop lying and Jesus save us." "CM," Fifi whispered, breath fogging the glass. "No B film." He zoomed on a woman limping with one shoe, blouse torn. 3 men trailed her with sticks, close but not close enough to commit. She fell against a parked car. When a helper reached for her, she turned with the same wrong slowness Chris had noticed, and her mouth fastened on the soft meat at the base of his thumb. The man screamed and swung. The comments exploded into exclamation points and prayers. Fifi had filmed fights and floods and a truck stuck sideways under a bridge. He had filmed police slaps and market dances. He had never filmed the end of something. His mother's voice surfaced as a ghost. "Eat something before you faint." The room smelled of damp clothes. The building breathed in the heat and exhaled the sound of someone moving on the landing too slowly to be a neighbor. He ended the stream because the comments felt like a promise he could not keep. He plugged the phone into a power bank and listened for the generator. It stayed silent. He picked up a kitchen knife and put it in his pocket without knowing how to use it, the way a child might carry a lucky stone. By noon, the city began to break the way wet earth slides into a river. At Mile 1 Market, a bus rolled onto its side after the driver slumped. People climbed out through shattered windows, bleeding and furious. A man with an arm twisted wrong staggered toward a fruit stall, working his mouth like he was trying to learn a new word. When he lunged at the seller's shoulder and came away with skin, the scream peeled the day. Stalls tipped. Tomatoes poured like red coins. A woman ran and fell and disappeared under feet. At the edge of Yakubu Gowon Stadium, a pickup swerved to miss a figure who stepped into the road like she'd forgotten what roads were. The truck clipped a barrier. Soldiers raised their rifles. Someone shouted, "Don't shoot," and someone else shouted, "Shoot." And then the decision made itself because a boy with his leg bent backward kept crawling toward the line. On the waterfront at Borikiri, fishermen hauled their nets and cursed the weight. Bodies slid over the gunnel with the catch, white-eyed and water-slow, hands opening and closing as if remembering nets of their own. Men leapt into the shallows to pull free, not yet understanding that some waters do not wash anything off. Rumor outran truth like it always does, but truth followed with heavier feet. The radio began to stutter around the word, contain the way a child stutters around a lie. A statement declared there was no cause for alarm and then listed the reasons to be afraid. The power went and stayed gone. The sound of generators turned neighborhoods into islands that blinked and sank. Chris cut through side streets he knew from years of shortcuts and schoolboy mischief. Around him, the city shook itself like a dog, trying to shed something it couldn't. Ahead, a clot of people backed away from something he couldn't yet see. A woman tripped and went down. A man bent to lift her and was pulled forward out of sight. The crowd convulsed and spread, and Chris slid along a wall with his head low. He thought of Jonah's gait, of the hard line of the cutlass and the steadiness in the older man's voice even when he lied. He thought, home. He thought, hold. He did not think the word safe because it no longer made sense in his mouth. Amaka left the hospital because the hospital had finished being a hospital and become a place where walls multiplied the sound of dying. She moved with a knot of staff and relatives who had seen enough to prefer the street. They stepped around a trolley tipped on its side, around a door that shook under fists from the other side, around a smear of blood that looked like a child had dragged a brush too long across a page. Outside, heat lifted off a line of cars, abandoned at angles, as if each driver had reached the same thought at the same moment. A man in a white shirt stood arguing into a dead phone with someone he loved. He kept saying listen as if the connection could be bullied into kindness. A woman clutched at Amaka's sleeve. Doctor, Abeg, my brother. I am sorry, Amaka said, meaning it exactly and completely, and also meaning no. She did not have the things that made a doctor anymore. She had only the memory of them and a metal tray she kept like a totem because her hands refused to be empty. She cut to a side road to avoid the knot of people pushing toward the gate. She did not realize she was crying until a tear reached her mouth and tasted of salt and mask. In Diobu, neighbors argued about God and soldiers and which mattered more on a day like this. Someone said the soldiers would shoot anyone running. Someone said the soldiers were running themselves. Someone said a man can live 3 days without water if he sits still and doesn't let fear burn through his body like kerosene. Someone said his grandmother had lived 5 days in the war on dry Gary and faith. Someone else asked if the grandmother had been chased by people who didn't stop when they fell. Jonah fixed boards and listened. He told his eldest to fill every container with water while the tap still coughed. He told the youngest to sit on the floor and count. He told himself to breathe in sets of 4. From the lane came the sound he'd been waiting for. Not panic, not rumor, not a crowd, but a single body slamming iron. The gate rattled. Nails creaked. Through the smallest gap a hand appeared, gray skin like damp paper, nails rimmed with dirt like the edges of a shallow grave. The fingers flexed blindly. A child screamed. Jonah swung, and the hand fell back with a wet thud, the fingers still twitching on the ground as if they hadn't received the message. He looked up at the neighbors staring, mouths open, minds refusing admission. "Close the gap," he said in a voice that allowed no alternative. "Now." Fifi watched a man stumble into the middle of the junction and begin to turn slowly as if looking for a lost song. 2 women called to him from the shade of a shop front. He moved toward them, step by uneven step, dragging one foot. Fifi filmed until his hands shook too much. He set the phone down and leaned his head against the cool concrete of the window frame. "God, Abeg," he said to no one he could name. A door downstairs banged open. Someone ran up the steps, then stopped halfway, as if remembering something important and wrong. The building felt suddenly too full of breath. Fifi slid the bolt across his door and put the knife on the table where he could see it. The blade looked small enough to be a toy. He imagined using it and could not picture a second swing. He sat on the floor with his back to the bed and listened to the city decide what to be next. Afternoon sagged into something darker, without the sky changing much. Smoke made its own weather. The radio found a clear band for a moment, an official voice advising people to remain indoors, avoid rumors, avoid crowds, wait for information. The voice apologized for technical difficulties. The voice asked for calm. The voice cut off mid-syllable. Chris reached Education bus stop and saw the first bodies that were not accidents. A man lay face down with the back of his skull open like a broken coconut. Another had been stamped by a crowd into something unnameable. A woman rocked beside a figure wrapped in bright cloth, her mouth open without sound. He almost went to help her stand, the way he had seen people help strangers 1,000 times in this city. He did not move. He did not look at her face. If he did, he would stay. He turned down an alley that smelled of fry oil and old rain. 2 boys lingered at the far end with a length of pipe between them. Their eyes flicked to his bag. He lifted his chin in the small language of the street. No, they let him pass because fear had made everyone either older or smaller, and they decided he was older. On Abba Road, a line of soldiers tried to push a crowd back with their hands and their voices. A man in a blue shirt ran at them. 2 rifles rose. Someone at the edge shouted that the man was only trying to reach his mother. The man didn't slow when the first shot cracked. He didn't fall either, not right away. He reached the nearest soldier, and the scuffle turned into something ugly and close. Then the soldier changed his grip, and the blue shirt went still. Chris turned away and wished for the smallness of bolts and nuts. When the rain finally came, it came hard, as if the sky had woken from a bad dream and decided to scrub itself clean. Water hammered roofs and flattened trash into the gutters. It turned blood into pink rivers that ran along the curb and into drains that gurgled and choked. It plastered election posters to walls until faces ran like paint. Chris crossed a puddled median and nearly collided with a woman in blood-smeared scrubs. They steadied themselves in the same instant. Their eyes met, hers rimmed red. his wide with the shock of a child trying to be a man. "Sorry," he said, breathless. "You day okay?" She nodded once, lying. "No road on that side," she said, jerking her head the way she'd come. "Crowd and something else." He didn't ask what something else was. He could hear it, a block away, a group sound with a hunger braided through it, as if a choir were singing through broken throats. They moved in opposite directions, each carrying a small piece of the other, the way strangers do in a city that forces lives to brush. Night crept in like a stain. NEPA's absence became a physical thing. Generators coughed to life one by one, islands of noise that could be followed and attacked. The city flickered candle by candle. From a veranda in Diobu came the low sound of people singing under their breath, an old song that reminded walls what endurance felt like. The song stopped when hands slapped the gate again and again in a steady rhythm that threatened to overwrite anything gentle. Jonah stood with his weight forward, ready, the cutlass nested against his palm as if it had grown there. He counted under his breath, a soldier's trick stolen from a friend long gone. He told his boys to lie on the floor and cover their ears if the gate went. He told the neighbors to keep their eyes high and their swings short. He told himself morning existed even if he could not imagine it. Fifi sat on the tile and tried to make the phone pull power out of a dead bank through will. He pressed the button as if it were a prayer bead. The building trembled once, lightly, like a living thing startled in sleep. He blew out a stub of candle and let the dark measure him. Amaka found a thin overhang outside a shuttered shop and sat with her back against the door, knees to chest, tray beside her like a shield. She listened to the rain soften and to the night fill with new rules. She repeated to herself the few things she knew. Fever leads to death. Death does not stay. The returns seek heat and noise and blood. She did not know yet what unmade them. She only knew people chose faster when they could name their fear. Chris reached the mouth of Jonah's street and saw the gate in his mind before he saw it with his eyes. He thought of knocking and of the sound knocking would make. He thought of climbing and how that would look from inside. He thought of calling Jonah's name and how names were not magic but sometimes unlocked doors. He stopped one house short under an awning and waited because sometimes the difference between living and not living is whether you add one more sound to a night already too loud. The city breathed in. The city did not breathe out. Port Harcourt burned where it flooded and flooded where it burned, and it listened to itself learn a new vocabulary of hunger. The outbreak wasn't coming. It was here. Chapter 3, Convergence in Chaos. The sky above Port Harcourt was a bruised gray, swollen with the promise of another rainstorm. But the storm that mattered had already broken. Smoke rose from multiple points in the city, black pillars twisting into the humid air. Gunfire cracked in stuttering bursts, followed by screams that carried through alleys and across crowded streets. The infection was no longer rumor. It was no longer whispers in markets or shaky videos on WhatsApp. It was here, and it was everywhere. Chris sprinted through Abba Road, his boots slapping puddles left by the morning rain. His lungs burned, but adrenaline carried him forward. Around him chaos churned. A Kiki Napep skidded into a lamppost, its passengers spilling out in a tangle of limbs. One man rose, limping, only to lunge at a fleeing woman. Her scream cut through the roar of the street like glass. Chris forced himself not to look back. He needed to reach Diobu, to find Jonah. That was the only thought anchoring him as the city dissolved into madness. He cut through side streets, ducking past shuttered shops and abandoned stalls. NEPA had taken the light hours ago, leaving only the erratic growl of generators and the glow of fires. Port Harcourt was a city used to hardship, to improvising through dysfunction. But nothing had prepared it for the dead rising in its markets. At Education bus stop, he collided with a woman in bloodied scrubs. They both stumbled, nearly falling. "Watch where they go," Chris snapped before seeing her face, pale and haunted. Her chest heaved, eyes wide with terror. I just came from the hospital," she said, her voice hoarse. "They're everywhere." "Nobody's safe." Chris blinked, recognition dawning. This was no ordinary passerby. She was a doctor, someone who had seen the outbreak up close. Dr. Amaka Obi gripped the metal tray she still carried, her knuckles white. Hours of running had smeared the blood on her scrubs into streaks. Her entire body trembled from exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Not after what she'd seen. "The patients," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We thought it was seizures, infection, madness, but they kept getting back up. Gunshots barely stopped them." Chris stared, his mind struggling to process her words. "Gunshots?" "Head," she said flatly, meeting his eyes. "Only the head works. I saw it. God help us all." Before Chris could reply, a roar of voices rose behind them. A wave of terrified people flooded down the street, chased by staggering corpses with torn faces and twitching limbs. "Run!" Chris shouted, grabbing Amaka's arm. Together they bolted, weaving through the stampede. In Diobu, Jonah Bassi stood on his compound balcony, cutlass gleaming in his grip. Below, the gate rattled as neighbors hammered nails and wedged scrap iron into the gaps. The compound had turned into a makeshift fortress, a circle of frightened families clutching children and food baskets. He barked orders like a man possessed. "You! Move that plank higher! You, bring me hammer! If dem come here, we know they open!" His voice carried authority, but behind his hard eyes, fear gnawed like a rat. Inside, Nkechi clutched their children, tears streaking her face. "Jonah, a beg, we can't stay. We must find car. Leave this city." Jonah shook his head, jaw clenched. "Road no safe. Now here we go fight. Now here we go survive." Gunfire echoed from nearby Aquari Road, followed by screams. Jonah's grip tightened on the cutlass. He had fought thieves before. He had fought hunger, poverty, corruption. But nothing had ever sounded like this. In his darkened apartment near Waterlines Junction, Fifi huddled by the window, phone pressed to his face. His live stream flickered with weak signal, but comments still scrolled across his screen. "Is this real? Fake news, bro. OMG, run!" He swallowed hard, his voice a whisper. "Look outside. You go see. No be film. Them dey eat people like goat." The camera panned shakily over the street. Fires burned where a fuel tanker had overturned. Corpses staggered through the smoke, jaws working, arms clawing. A group of men tried to fight them with sticks and stones, but when one man went down, the others panicked and ran. Fifi zoomed in on a child standing alone by the wreckage. For a second, he thought about going to help, but the child turned, its face bloodied, teeth gnashing. Fifi dropped the phone with a strangled cry, his hands shaking violently. His viewers saw everything. Chris and Amaka stumbled into Ikwari Road, gasping for breath. Ahead, Jonah's fortified compound loomed, its iron gate bristling with scrap wood. Jonah spotted them instantly from the balcony. "You two! Move away from the gate!" he barked, cutlass raised. "We're not infected," Amaka shouted, desperation cracking her voice. "Please, let us in." Jonah hesitated. He didn't trust strangers, not in this madness. But then he saw the horde rounding the corner. Dozens of corpses, their groans swelling into a chorus of hunger. His gut clenched. If he left these two outside, the horde would smash against the gate harder, maybe breaking through. With a curse, he waved to the men below. "Open! Quick!" The gate creaked open just long enough for Chris and Amaka to slip inside. It slammed shut behind them as the first of the infected slammed against the iron bars, snarling. Inside, the compound erupted in panic. Children screaming, women wailing, men pressing their weight against the barricades. Jonah barked orders, trying to restore order. Chris collapsed against a wall, chest heaving, while Amaka bent double, hands on her knees. For the first time, the three of them were together. At that same moment, Fifi's live stream cut abruptly. The screen went black, replaced by silence. But the boy was still alive, crouched in the corner of his apartment. Heart pounding in his ears, the groans of the infected were rising outside his door. He wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Somewhere in the city, his path was drawing closer to theirs. The storm clouds finally broke, rain hammering against rooftops, hissing against burning cars. The water did nothing to cleanse the city. It only drowned out the screams. Inside the compound, Chris, Amaka, and Jonah stared at one another, strangers bound by desperation. Port Harcourt was gone. Survival had only just begun. Chapter 4. A City Under Siege. The rain hammered Port Harcourt all night, falling in heavy sheets that turned alleys into rivers of brown water and plastered posters of smiling politicians to the walls in soggy strips. The city was drowning in more than rain. The screams had not stopped. The gunfire had not stopped. And neither had the hunger of the dead. Inside the compound, Jonah's compound reeked of fear and kerosene fumes. Dozens of families had squeezed themselves into corners, clutching children in bags stuffed with hurriedly gathered belongings. Some cried softly, others prayed under their breath, their whispers rising and falling with each thud against the barricaded gate. Chris sat on the floor, back against the damp wall, his hands trembling as he cleaned an old spanner he had picked up earlier, like it was a weapon. He couldn't get the images out of his head, teeth sinking into flesh, blood spraying across tomatoes at the market, the doctor's voice insisting only the head could kill them. Amaka stood apart, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, her scrubs stiff with dried blood. She watched the compound's residents with clinical eyes, cataloging fear, exhaustion, and festering wounds. A boy whimpered in the corner, clutching a bandaged arm. The blood had already seeped through. She bit her lip. She knew what that meant. Jonah paced the compound like a soldier, his cutlass gleaming in the lamplight. Every so often, he barked orders to the younger men. Shift that plank. Tighten that rope. If dem break gate, now all of us go die. His voice carried authority, but behind his hard eyes, fear gnawed like a rat. When the pounding at the gate grew louder, Chris finally spoke. They won't stop, Jonah glared. And you would make I open the gate? You get sense at all? I'm saying, Chris replied carefully, they'll keep coming until we find another way. Maybe a place stronger. Higher ground. Amaka cut in, her voice steady. Hospitals are overrun. Markets are gone. The soldiers are shooting anyone on the streets. There's no safe place. Then what do we do? A woman cried from the corner. God, a beg, we go all die here? Jonah slammed his cutlass against the metal railing, silencing the compound. We fight, and we hold. Nobody to go anywhere. But even as he said it, thunder rumbled overhead, and the gate shuddered under the weight of the dead pressing against it. Fifi forced out. Across town at Waterlines Junction, Fifi sat in darkness. His phone battery had finally died, leaving him with only the hiss of rain on the roof and the guttural groans outside his door. The dead had been clawing at the apartment block for hours, their fists pounding against iron bars and weak wooden doors. Neighbors screamed as barricades gave way. The groans grew louder with every minute. Fifi held a kitchen knife, his hands slick with sweat, his stomach cramped with hunger. He hadn't eaten since morning. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. The hallway was chaos, thuds, splintering wood, and the wet sound of feeding. Then silence. Fifi's breath caught. He waited, seconds stretching into an eternity. Slowly, he cracked the door open. The corridor was dark, the generator long dead. Rainwater dripped through cracks in the ceiling. He stepped into the hall, the knife trembling in his grip. Bodies lay scattered, torn apart. His neighbors. The air stank of rot. A floorboard creaked. Fifi froze. From the far end of the hall, a shape stirred. A man with half his face missing, jaw slack, eyes white. It groaned and staggered toward him. Fifi's scream tore through the building as he bolted for the stairs, knife clattering to the floor. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The gate breach. At Jonah's compound, the pounding at the gate reached a fever pitch. Wood splintered. Iron groaned. The dead pressed harder, their groans rising in a hideous chorus. Jonah rallied the men, cutlass raised. If dem enter, cut their head. No fear. The first plank snapped, and a hand burst through the gap, clawing blindly. Women shrieked, pulling their children back. Chris grabbed a hammer and swung at the hand until bone cracked and fingers fell limp. Another one! Someone shouted. The gate buckled again. Amaka's gaze snapped to the boy with the bandaged arm. His whimpers had turned to guttural groans. His mother clutched him, begging God to intervene. But Amaka knew there was no prayer strong enough to stop what was coming. She moved fast. Grabbing a broken chair leg, she struck hard across the boy's skull. The crack silenced the compound. The mother's scream followed, piercing and raw. Everyone stared at Amaka in horror. but she only wiped blood from her face, her eyes cold. "If we don't do it now," she said, voice shaking but firm, "he'll turn, and then we'll all be dead." Jonah looked at her, then at Chris. He didn't speak, but the truth had been laid bare. The fight wasn't just against the dead outside, it was against time, infection, and impossible choices. Across the city, Fifi stumbled into the flooded streets, rain soaking him to the bone. The city was unrecognizable. Cars overturned, buildings burning, soldiers firing blindly into hordes. He ducked behind a broken kiosk, gasping. The infected moved in packs now, shambling but relentless, their groans echoing through the rain. He saw one stagger past holding a chunk of flesh in its teeth. Another crawled on shattered legs, dragging itself toward the sound of gunfire. Port Harcourt was no longer a city. It was a graveyard with beating hearts. Fifi clutched his stomach, forcing himself forward. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't stay alone. Not anymore. Siege night. Back at the compound, night fell with only lanterns for light. The rain eased, but the pounding on the gate never stopped. Families huddled together, whispering prayers, jumping at every groan. Jonah stood watch with Chris and Amaka, their eyes heavy but unblinking. Each thud against the gate reminded them of how fragile their barricade truly was. Amaka broke the silence. "This won't hold forever." Jonah's jaw tightened. "Then we hold until we can't." Chris stared at the gate, rain dripping from his hair. Somewhere in the city, a boy named Fifi was running through the dark. Somewhere beyond the barricade, the dead pressed closer. And somewhere inside each of them, the truth had already taken root. Survival would demand more than strength. It would demand sacrifice. The rain stopped. The night was silent except for the groans at the gate. For now the compound still stood. But dawn would bring another test. Chapter 5. Ashes of Trust. The night had passed, but it brought no peace. By dawn, the air in Jonah's compound was thick with the sour stench of sweat, kerosene smoke, and fear. The pounding on the gate had quieted in the early morning, but the groans still lingered just beyond the barricade like a warning that silence was never safety. Inside the walls. Chris woke with a start, his back stiff from sleeping against the wall. He blinked, disoriented, until the sounds of muffled crying and whispered prayers reminded him where he was. A small crowd had gathered near the gate. A man named Chike, one of Jonah's neighbors, was pacing angrily, his voice rising with each word. "This place no safe," Cheek shouted. "Every night na the same thing. Thud, thud, thud. Dem go break the gate soon, and we go all die inside like goat." "Lower your voice," Jonah growled, stepping forward, cutlass at his side. Cheek pointed the blade of his finger at Jonah. "You dey deceive us. You talk say we fit hold here. But how long? We dey starve. The children dey cry for food. Water almost finish. How long you go keep us locked inside like prisoner?" Jonah's jaw clenched, but before he could answer, Amaka cut in. "He's right. Supplies won't last. We need a plan." Chris glanced between them, unease coiling in his stomach. He had always known Port Harcourt was built on tension, between rich and poor, between neighbors and strangers. But now, trapped behind rusting gates, he could feel that tension sharpening into something more dangerous than the groans outside. Jonah's voice was low, but it carried iron. "Anybody want leave? Go. But if you open that gate, na death you dey bring to all of us." The compound fell silent. No one dared move. Amaka's dilemma. Later, Amaka knelt by a sick woman in one corner, pressing her palm against a sweaty forehead. The woman shivered violently, her lips cracked, her eyes glassy. A deep bite mark marred her shoulder. "Please," the woman whispered, "help me." Amaka's chest tightened. "I can't. Not from this." The woman's grip slackened. Tears streaked her face as she exhaled one last time. Silence fell over the corner. For a heartbeat, Amaka prayed it was over. Then the woman's body jerked. Her eyes snapped open, milky and lifeless. Her jaw worked, teeth clacking together. "Jonah!" Amaka shouted. The cutlass swung down in a flash of steel. Jonah's blade split the woman's skull with a sickening crack, silencing her forever. Gas filled the compound. Jonah stood over the corpse, chest heaving. "Anybody bitten? Talk now, or you go endanger us all." No one spoke, but Amaka saw the fear in their eyes, and she knew more were hiding wounds. Chris, the reluctant voice. Chris had watched it all unfold from the shadows. His hands shook as he gripped the spanner he still carried. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a soldier. But he knew one truth. The compound wouldn't hold forever. That night, while Jonah argued with Chike and Amaka tended to another wounded child, Chris pulled aside two young men. "We can't stay," he whispered. "The gate no-go last. We need plan B." "Where?" one asked nervously. Chris swallowed. "Anywhere with food. High walls, maybe GRA, maybe even the stadium. I know no, but here in a coffin." He didn't realize Jonah was watching from the balcony. Their eyes met for a brief, charged second. Jonah's jaw clenched. Chris had just made himself a threat. "Fifi, through the ruins." Meanwhile, Fifi crept through old GRA's back streets, his clothes torn, his stomach clawing with hunger. The city was unrecognizable. Shops gutted, cars abandoned, the stench of rot in every gutter. He passed the shell of a burnt-out bus, its windows smeared with blood. Corpses lay inside, motionless. He held his breath and kept walking. In the distance, he spotted movement, living people. A small group huddled around a fire in front of a shuttered pharmacy. His heart leapt. He hadn't seen another living soul in hours. But as he approached, one of them raised a machete, his eyes wild. "Stop there," the man barked. "I no get anything," Fifi pleaded, raising empty hands. "A beg. I just dey find shelter." The man's companions laughed bitterly. "Shelter? No be house remain again. Everywhere, don't spoil. Go your way before I use you as food." Fear gripped Fifi. He turned and fled into the rain-soaked alleys, their mocking laughter chasing him. The living were no safer than the dead. The breach. That night, the compound shook with a thunderous crack. The gate buckled inward as dozens of hands clawed and beat against it. A hole had opened, small but growing. Panic erupted. Families screamed, rushing toward the far corners of the yard. Men scrambled to reinforce the barricade with planks and metal sheets. Jonah barked orders, swinging his cutlass at the grasping arms that punched through. Chris hammered at nails with frantic energy. Amaka shoved children behind her, her eyes darting for weapons. The dead howled outside, their voices merging into a single monstrous roar. The compound wouldn't hold much longer. Across the street, Fifi reached Iguere Road just as the rain began again. He froze when he saw them, shadows moving in the storm. Dozens of corpses swarmed against a compound gate, their bodies pressed together, arms tearing at the barricade. Inside, he heard screams. He didn't know it yet, but he had found Jonah's fortress, and the decision he made next would change everything. Chapter 6, Cracks in the Walls. The compound smelled of smoke and fear. By morning, the air was heavy with damp clothes, rotting food, and the sour tang of sweat. The pounding at the gate had lessened, but no one believed the danger had passed. They all knew the dead were still out there, waiting, pressing, listening. Jonah, the burden of leadership. Jonah stood watch at the gate, cutlass in hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his muscles aching from days without proper rest. The compound looked to him for strength, but he could feel the weight dragging him down. He had fought thieves. He had fought hunger. He had even fought corrupt policemen who tried to shake him down during his shifts as a guard. But this was different. This enemy did not sleep, did not fear, did not stop. Behind him, voices rose again in argument. "We can't just sit here," Chike barked, his voice carrying. "The soldiers' day for River State University. People say dem get camped there, with food and light. Why we still lock here like rat?" Jonah turned slowly, his glare sharp enough to cut. "Soldiers? You trust soldiers? Na dem I see for Rumokoro. Shooting people, way just they run. You want carry your wife and children go give them bullet? Go if your leg day itch you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fear was no longer their only enemy. It was mistrust. Amaka, the doctor's choice. In the far corner, Amaka knelt by the sick woman she had been watching since yesterday. The bite on her shoulder had festered overnight, the flesh swollen and gray. The woman's breathing was ragged, her eyes glazed. "Doctor," the woman whispered, clutching Amaka's wrist with surprising strength. "Please, save me." Amaka's throat burned. "I can't. Not from this." The woman's grip slackened. Tears streaked her face as she exhaled one last time. Silence fell over the corner. For a heartbeat, Amaka prayed it was over. Then the woman's body jerked. Her eyes snapped open, milky and lifeless. Her jaw worked, teeth clacking together. "Jonah!" Amaka shouted. The cutlass swung down in a flash of steel. Jonah's blade split the woman's skull with a sickening crack, silencing her forever. Gasps filled the compound. Jonah stood over the corpse, chest heaving. "Anybody bitten, talk now, or you go endanger us all." No one spoke, but Amaka saw the fear in their eyes, and she knew more were hiding wounds. Chris, the reluctant voice. Chris had watched it all unfold from the shadows. His hands shook as he gripped the spanner he still carried. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a soldier. But he knew one truth. The compound wouldn't hold forever. That night, while Jonah argued with Chike and Amaka tended to another wounded child, Chris pulled aside two young men. "We can't stay," he whispered. "The gate no-go last. We need plan B." "Where?" one asked nervously. Chris swallowed. "Anywhere with food. High walls, maybe GRA, maybe even the stadium. I don't know. But here, not coffin." He didn't realize Jonah was watching from the balcony. Their eyes met for a brief, charged second. Jonah's jaw clenched. Chris had just made himself a threat. "Fifi, through the ruins." Meanwhile, Fifi crept through Diobu's back streets, his clothes torn, his stomach gnawing with hunger. The city was unrecognizable. Shops gutted, cars abandoned, the stench of rot in every gutter. He passed the shell of a burnt-out bus, its windows smeared with blood. Corpses lay inside, motionless. He held his breath and kept walking. In the distance, he spotted movement. Living people. A small group huddled around a fire in front of a shuttered pharmacy. His heart leapt. He hadn't seen another living soul in hours. But as he approached, one of them raised a machete, his eyes wild. "Stop there," the man barked. "I no get anything," Fifi pleaded, raising empty hands. "A beg. I just stay find shelter." The man's companions laughed bitterly. "Shelter? No bee house remain again. Everywhere don't spoil. Go your way before I use you as food." Fear gripped Fifi. He turned and fled into the rain-soaked alleys, their mocking laughter chasing him. The living were no safer than the dead. The breach. That night, the compound shook with a thunderous crack. The gate buckled inward as dozens of hands clawed and beat against it. A hole had opened, small but growing. Panic erupted. Families screamed, rushing toward the far corners of the yard. Men scrambled to reinforce the barricade with planks and metal sheets. Jonah barked orders, swinging his cutlass at the grasping arms that punched through. Chris hammered at nails with frantic energy. Amaka shoved children behind her, her eyes darting for weapons. The dead howled outside, their voices merging into a single monstrous roar. The compound wouldn't hold much longer. Across the street, Fifi reached Iquere Road just as the rain began again. He froze when he saw them, shadows moving in the storm. Dozens of corpses swarmed against a compound gate, their bodies pressed together, arms tearing at the barricade. Inside, he heard screams. He didn't know it yet, but he had found Jonah's fortress. And the decision he made next would change everything. Chapter 7. The world has fallen. The pounding on the gate had become the rhythm of life inside Jonah's compound. Every groan outside, every claw against the rusted metal, was a reminder that the city no longer belonged to the living. The survivors inside barely slept. They ate what little food they had, huddled around lanterns, praying the barricade would hold for one more night. But hope was thinning. The broadcast. In the early hours of the morning, someone managed to start a small radio with half-dead batteries. The crackling voice that came through was faint but chilling. Outbreak spreading across Nigeria. Reports from Abuja, Lagos, Enugu. Hospitals overrun. Government unable to maintain order. All citizens advised to remain indoors. Stay away from crowds. Do not approach the infected. God help us. The signal cut with a screech of static. Silence filled the compound. Chris's stomach twisted. He had feared this truth, but hearing it confirmed was different. This wasn't just Port Harcourt. It wasn't just their street. The whole country was burning. Amaka sat rigid, her fists clenched. If Abuja has fallen, then there's no government left. No rescue, no cure. Jonah spat into the dirt, his jaw tight. Then we don't wait for rescue. We fight. We endure. But even as he said it, the compound erupted in whispers. Some prayed louder, clutching their children. Others wept openly, and Chike seized the moment. "You hear him now," Chike shouted. "Now everywhere. Lagos, Abuja. We go sit here till we starve? We must leave before them break gate. We go find soldier camp or boat for waterfront." Fear rippled through the crowd. The barricade had held so far, but for how much longer? The fracture. That afternoon, an argument broke into violence. Two men fought over the last bucket of water, their fists cracking against each other's faces. Jonah waded in with his cutlass, slamming it against the wall to silence them. "Anybody steal water again? I go cut your hand," he roared. But his words did nothing to ease the deeper fracture forming inside the walls. Chris could see it, the way people glanced at Jonah with doubt, the way Chike gathered supporters with promises of escape. Amaka pulled Chris aside. "If this continues, they'll kill each other before the dead even get in." Chris swallowed. "What's the alternative?" Her eyes met his, hard and unflinching. "We need to leave before the choice is taken from us." Fifi, at the gate. Meanwhile, Fifi crouched across the street, rain soaking his thin clothes. He had watched all night as the dead hammered against the compound's gate, their groans echoing in his skull. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His head swam with dizziness. But inside that compound, he heard voices, living voices. He couldn't walk away. At dawn, he made his move. He crept along the gutter, keeping low, until he was pressed against the outer wall. His hands trembled as he banged on the iron. "Help! Please! A beg! Open! I no get anywhere else!" Inside, panic exploded. Mothers clutched their children. Men shouted. Jonah's voice cut above them all. "Quiet!" He pressed against the gate, listening. A boy's voice, desperate, thin. Chris stepped forward. "It's just one. We can bring him in." Cheek snarled. "You they mad? Open that gate. The horde go rush in and finish all of us." The pounding outside grew louder. Not just Fifi's hands, but the infected drawn to the noise. Their groans rose into a frenzy. "Jonah," Amaka cried. "Decide now." The breach. The decision was ripped from them. The gate shuddered, iron groaning as rusted hinges tore free. Dozens of hands burst through, clawing at the barricade. The infected poured against the compound like a living flood. Screams erupted. Families scattered. The survivors inside swung sticks, hammers, anything they could find. Blood splattered across the yard. Jonah roared, his cutlass cleaving into skulls. Chris fought with his spanner, arms aching with each desperate swing. Amaka dragged children behind her, shielding them with a broken chair leg. Through the chaos, Jonah saw him, a boy outside the gate, pressed against the iron, eyes wide with terror. "Open!" Jonah bellowed. "Now!" For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Chris shoved the plank free, yanking Fifi inside. The gate slammed shut again, but not before 3 of the dead forced their way through. The yard became a slaughterhouse. Aftermath. By the time the last corpse lay still, the compound was unrecognizable. Blood stained the walls. 3 survivors had been bitten. 1 child lay dead, his mother rocking his body, wailing into the night. Fifi crouched in the corner, shaking violently, his face pale with hunger and shock. Chris knelt beside him, offering half a loaf of stale bread. "What's your name?" Chris asked softly. Ifeanyi, the boy whispered. But everybody they call me Fifi. Amaka sat nearby, her eyes hollow. Jonah paced, cutlass dripping red. Cheeky glared at them all, his face twisted with fury. The compound had survived the night, but only just. And now with Fifi inside and supplies running out, they all knew the truth. The walls wouldn't save them much longer. Outside, the groans of the dead swelled again, louder than before. And above it all, the city of Port Harcourt burned. Chapter 8, Exodus. The compound was a tomb waiting to be sealed. The survivors knew it. They could feel it in every thud of fists against the gate, every groan that drifted in through the night air, every hollow stomach growl that gnawed at their ribs. By dawn, the water was gone. The food was gone. The trust that had barely held them together was gone. Jonah stood in the yard, cutlass in hand, his face lined with exhaustion. He had fought to make the compound a fortress, but no fortress could hold forever against an enemy that never slept. He looked at the others, Chris with his spanner, Amaka with her hollow eyes, Fifi crouched in the corner with crumbs of stale bread still clutched in his hand. Around them, families huddled in silence, their eyes sunken, their bodies thin. They had no choice left. The breaking point. It was Cheek who said it aloud. "We die slow here. Better we risk street than rot inside cage." Murmurs rose in agreement. Even Jonah's wife, Nkichi, placed a trembling hand on her husband's arm. "He's right. Our children day thirsty. If we stay, dem go die before hunger finish us." Jonah clenched his jaw, fury burning behind his eyes. But deep down, he knew she was right. He had fought to keep them safe, but safety had already bled out through the cracks. "We leave at first light," he said at last, his voice heavy. "Anybody no fit walk? Sorry. We no fit, carry load, we go kill all of us." Gasps followed his words. Mothers clutched children tighter, but no one argued. The decision had already been made for them by starvation and despair. Preparations. They packed what little remained: empty water jerry cans, sticks sharpened into spears, rusted machetes, scraps of food barely worth carrying. Chris tightened the straps of a torn backpack, sliding his spanner inside. Amaka wrapped strips of cloth around her hands, crude bandages to grip weapons without slipping in blood. Fifi followed silently, his wide eyes darting to the gate. He hadn't stopped shaking since the night he was pulled inside. Now he clung to Chris like a shadow. "Stay close," Chris told him. "No run. If you run, na death." Fifi nodded, though his legs already trembled. As dawn cracked the horizon, the compound door creaked open. The groans outside swelled instantly, the dead sensing the living like sharks scenting blood. Jonah raised his cutlass. "Move!" Into the streets. They spilled into Ikwere Road, the survivors pressing together in a tight knot. The city loomed around them, charred buildings, overturned cars, smoke twisting into the sky. Corpses staggered in the distance, their heads snapping toward the sound of movement. Jonah led, cutlass flashing. Chris stayed near the rear, pushing Fifi along, while Amaka kept close to the center, shielding children. The first horde came quick. From a side alley, dozens surged forward, their groans rising into a shriek. Panic ripped through the survivors. Some bolted instantly, scattering into the maze of streets. Jonah roared, swinging his blade, cleaving skulls. Chris swung his spanner with both hands, bone and blood spraying across the wet asphalt. "Head, go for head!" Amaka shouted, her voice cutting through the screams. But panic had already broken them. Families scattered, their screams vanishing into alleys. The horde swarmed the slowest, dragging them down into red ruin. By the time the survivors regrouped, half their number was gone. Fifi's terror. Fifi clung to Chris, his breath ragged. He stumbled on a corpse and nearly fell before Chris yanked him upright. I can't do this," Fifi sobbed, his voice breaking. "You don't get choice," Chris snapped. "You fight or you die." A corpse lurched toward them, teeth snapping. Fifi screamed, shoving it weakly. The spanner came down from Chris, crushing its skull. Blood sprayed across the boy's face. He gagged but kept moving. Something inside him cracked that moment. Not strength, but the first threads of survival instinct. Amaka's truth. As they pushed forward, Amaka fell back beside Jonah. Her face was grim. "We can't keep running blind. We need direction." "Where?" Jonah barked. "Market? Hospital? All Don spoil." Amaka's eyes narrowed. "The waterfront. People will try boats. If there's any chance out of this city, it's there." Jonah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine. Waterfront." The bridge. By midday, they reached Garrison Flyover, its concrete stained with smoke and blood. Corpses littered the road, torn apart by what looked like military gunfire. Burned-out trucks blocked half the path. Jonah motioned for silence. The group crept forward, stepping over bodies. For a moment, it felt like they had found a pocket of calm in the storm. Then one of the corpses twitched. Its head rolled, eyes snapping open. Another groaned, rising slowly to its feet. They weren't corpses. They were waiting. The bridge erupted in chaos as the dead surged up, clawing and snapping. Collapse. The survivors screamed, bolting in every direction. Jonah hacked, his blade flashing. Chris swung wildly, dragging Fifi by the collar. Amaka shoved children forward, her face streaked with blood. One woman fell, her legs snapping on the concrete. She screamed for help, but no one turned back. The dead tore into her before her voice even faded. By the time the group stumbled off the bridge, only a fraction remained. Their breaths came in ragged gasps. Their eyes were wide with terror. Amaka looked around, her voice trembling. "We can't keep this up. We'll die before we even see the waterfront." Jonah wiped blood from his face, his expression grim. "Then we fight harder, or we die here." Chris said nothing. He only looked at Fifi, who sat on the curb, shaking, his hands stained with gore. Port Harcourt was gone. The world had fallen. Chapter 9. Toward the water. The survivors moved like ghosts through the city, silent but for the ragged sound of their breath. Port Harcourt was no longer recognizable. The markets that once overflowed with voices and color were now empty shells, scattered with bones and broken stalls. The air was thick with smoke and the sweet, cloying stench of rot. Jonah led, his cutlass dragging against his thigh, each step heavy. Chris stayed close to Fifi, who clung to him like a shadow, his eyes hollow. Amaka walked with the last of the children, her scrubs torn and stiff with dried blood, her face unreadable. Behind them trailed the remnants of the compound, fewer than 20 souls where once there had been dozens. They were heading toward Borokiri waterfront, clinging to whispers that boats might still be there, that perhaps the river could carry them away from the burning city. It was a fragile hope, but hope was all they had left. The city's silence. At Township School Road, they passed a row of burned buses, their windows shattered, the seats inside streaked with blood. Amaka slowed, her eyes catching the chalk writing scrawled across the wall of a classroom. "No safe zone. God save us." Her stomach clenched. She had worked in hospitals, had seen plague and panic before, but nothing like this. The message was a confession written in desperation, and it echoed the truth she already knew. She pressed forward, saying nothing. The hungry divide. By midday, their hunger gnawed louder than their fear. They stopped briefly at an abandoned provision store near Audiobook Mile 1, but the shelves had been stripped bare. Rats skittered across the floor, bold in their starvation. "Nothing left," Chris muttered, slamming a cupboard shut. Cheek, still alive and still dangerous, stepped forward, his eyes sharp. "We can't keep this up. We need food now. If we find group with supplies, we take it. Not survival." Jonah spun, his cutlass raised. "You one turned thief now. You one kill living when dead day everywhere?" Chike sneered. "Better thief than corpse." The group tensed, fear shifting into something sharper. Paranoia. Distrust. For a moment, it looked as if blood would spill between the living before the dead even arrived. Amaka's voice cut through the tension. "We don't have time for this. Every second we waste, they close in." Her words held just enough truth to silence them. For now. Fifi's fear. As they moved again, Fifi stumbled beside Chris, his breath shallow. "Chris," he whispered, "we go survive?" Chris didn't answer immediately. He looked at the boy, his torn shirt, his blood-stained face, his shaking hands. He saw himself at that age, desperate, hungry, clinging to any scrap of protection. Finally, Chris said softly, "I know no, but as long as you day with me, I no go leave you." Fifi nodded, tears streaking down his dirty cheeks. For the first time since the outbreak began, he managed a weak smile. The soldiers. At Lagos bus stop, they stumbled across the remnants of a military checkpoint. Sandbags and rusted oil drums formed a crude barricade. Dozens of bullet casings littered the ground, and behind the barrier, sprawled in the mud, were the bodies of soldiers in green fatigues. Jonah moved cautiously, cutlass raised. One of the corpses twitched, rising slowly to its feet, half its jaw missing. Jonah's blade flashed, cleaving its skull. The others searched quickly. Chris found an old rifle, its barrel bent. Amaka uncovered a half-empty medical kit. Jonah discovered a jerry can of stale water, enough for a few sips each. But there were no living soldiers, no safe zone. Fifi stared at the bodies, his stomach twisting. These men had been trained, armed, ready for war. And yet they had fallen like everyone else. "What chance we get?" he whispered. No one answered. The waterfront. By dusk, they reached Borikiri waterfront. The air stank of diesel and decay. Boats bobbed on the black water, some half submerged, others drifting aimlessly. Smoke rose from burned shacks along the shore. At first glance, the place was deserted. Then a groan rose from the docks. Dozens of corpses staggered in the shallow water, their arms reaching, their jaws snapping as they dragged themselves through the waves. Their clothes clung to their rotting bodies, waterlogged and heavy. Beyond them, at the far pier, a single boat still floated, intact. Hope surged through the survivors. Hope and terror. "That's our way out," Amaka whispered. Jonah's grip tightened on his cutlass. "Then we fight through." The choice. But Chike's voice rose behind them, hard and cold. "No, we can't all go. That boat no fit carry everybody. If we try, we sink." The group froze. He was right. The boat was small, barely more than a fishing canoe. It might carry a handful, but not 20. Whispers rose. Arguments erupted. Some shouted to rush the boat. Others clung to Jonah, demanding order. Mothers wailed, clutching children. The dead were already turning toward the noise, dragging themselves from the water. Chris felt Fifi's hand clutching his arm, trembling. Amaka's eyes darted between the boat and the infected. Jonah raised his cutlass, roaring to silence them. But there was no silence now. The waterfront had become a battlefield, between the living, the dead, and the weight of impossible choices. Chapter 10, No Escape. The waterfront stank of diesel, blood, and the rot of bodies swelling in the river. The groans of the infected rolled across the docks like thunder, and between the survivors and the single boat lay a tide of corpses, dragging themselves from the black water. Jonah stood at the front, cutlass gleaming in the fading light. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but carried the last flicker of defiance. Behind him, Chris gripped his blood-stained spanner. Amaka clutched the medical kit to her chest, and Fifi clung to Chris's sleeve, trembling violently. The others, the ragged remnants of the compound, clustered in fear, their voices rising in panic. Some begged to rush the boat, others demanded order, but there was no order left. The dead surged forward. The charge. "Move!" Jonah roared, cutting down the first corpse that lunged at the pier. The survivors broke into a desperate sprint, feet slamming against the wet planks. Mothers carried children. Men swung rusted machetes. Screams filled the humid air. Chris dragged Fifi with one hand while swinging his spanner with the other, skulls cracking under the blows. Amaka pushed through the chaos, her breath ragged. Every groan, every splash of water against the docks was a reminder that death was only a step behind. The boat grew closer. Hope flared like a dying candle. Betrayal. Then Chike shoved a man into the water, his eyes wild with desperation. "No space for all of us," he bellowed. He struck down another with a hammer, carving a bloody path to the boat. The group fractured instantly. Neighbors turned on neighbors, hacking, clawing, trampling. The infected crashed into the chaos, dragging both sides into the river. Jonah cut down three, his blade flashing, but a hand clamped around his ankle, pulling him to the ground. He roared, slashing wildly, blood spraying across the dock. Chris tried to reach him, but more of the dead surged in, forcing him back. The boat. Amaka reached the boat first, shoving two children into its belly. She turned, shouting for others to hurry, but then Chike leapt in, swinging his hammer, forcing others back. "This one mine," he snarled. Before anyone could stop him, the boat pushed from the pier, rocking violently. Inside, the children wailed as Chike grabbed the oars. The survivors on the dock screamed. Some dove after it, splashing into the water. But the river was already full of corpses, their jaws snapping, dragging swimmers under. The boat drifted into the current, then capsized as hands burst from the water, dragging its passengers down. The children's screams were cut short. Cheek's howl vanished beneath the river. The water churned red, then went still. The boat was gone. The last stand. The dock had become a slaughterhouse. Jonah fought like a lion, his cutlass cleaving skulls. But for every corpse he cut down, two more closed in. A hand tore across his arm, teeth sank into his shoulder. He staggered but did not fall. Amaka swung a broken plank, blood spraying across her face. "Chris! Fifi, run!" she screamed. Chris pulled Fifi toward the street, but the boy stumbled, his leg caught in the splintered boards. The dead swarmed, dragging him down. "Chris!" Fifi screamed, his hand outstretched. Chris reached for him, but Jonah's roar cut across the chaos. "Leave him! Save yourself!" Fifi's scream ended in gurgles as the dead consumed him. Chris's vision blurred with rage and grief. He swung his spanner until his arms gave out, until bone cracked and his body shook with exhaustion. A corpse crashed into him, teeth snapping. Another tore at his arm. He vanished beneath the weight of them. Amaka saw it all. She screamed his name, but it was lost in the roar of the dead. The end. Jonah staggered to his feet one last time, blood pouring from his wounds. He raised his cutlass, his voice breaking in defiance. "You no go take me easy." The dead swarmed him. His roar turned into silence. Amaka was the last. She stumbled down the pier, surrounded on all sides, her breath ragged, her arms shaking. She thought of the hospital, of the oath she had taken, of the lives she could not save. As the dead closed in, she raised her eyes to the black sky, rain pelting her face. For a fleeting second, she let herself believe there might be something beyond this horror, something kinder waiting in the dark. Then the dead fell upon her. The waterfront echoed with screams, then silence. The river carried the blood of Port Harcourt into the sea, and the city, once alive with voices and color, belonged fully to the dead.